Welcome to EPG Pathshala. I am Dr. Mrinmoy Pramanik. I teach comparative Indian language and literature at the University of Calcutta. Now we'll discuss module 12 of the paper Translation Studies, and that is translation as rewriting. The content of this module is written by Ria Roy Choudhury. That Merriam-Webster's dictionary defines translation as words that have been changed from one language into a different language, or the act of process of translating something into a different language, or the act of process of changing something from one form into another. In more technical terms, translation is the act of communicating a source language text into a target language. Derived from the Latin word translatio, translation is the act of bringing across ideas from different cultures and backgrounds. Due to the global diversity, translation has been an essential means of communication amongst people who come from diverse cultures, religions, regions, or races. In other words, it has become one of the basic needs of man. Lefever proposed the idea of translation as rewriting. Lefever's conception of translation was the notion of regarding translation as a form of rewriting was first developed by Lefever, who perceived translation as a process carried out under the influence of particular categories and norms constitute to system in a society. The most important of these are patronage, ideology, poetics, and the universe of discourse. Translation has never been an activity which takes place in isolation. It emerges out of a context or a historical background, following which a text is target text, translated from one language into another. Translation often has a purpose such as that of cultural enrichment or serving the literary demands of a target audience. In this case, it becomes difficult for the translator to serve his purpose and simultaneously maintain fidelity to the original. For instance, when a foreign text is translated for the domestic audience, the translator has to keep the domestic needs into consideration. This notion of influencing the readers is also propagated by Lefever, who states that rewriting is the adaptation of a work of literature to a different audience, with the intention of influencing the way in which that audience reads the work. The rewriting of the translation of Victor Hugo's Les Miserables by Munib Pasha, which was translated into a Turkish newspaper serial, forms a crucial example. A huge amount of suspense was maintained for the readers till the next issue, which not only increased readership of the audience and helped in the growth of journalism in the Reformation period of the 19th century of the Ottoman Empire, but also served the purpose of entertaining the readers. To go into deeper of the translation theory proposed by Lefever, which is popularly known as translation as rewriting, we have to see the background or the history of development of translation theory. So let us talk about Dryden's notion on translation. In order to understand the notion of translation as rewriting, we should first analyze some of the basic theories of translation. As I told, as proposed and propagated by a number of authors, scholars, and academicians. Perhaps the oldest amongst them is John Dryden, who has often been referred to as the theorist of translation. His major works in translation appear in the prefaces and dedications of certain literary works as Ovid's Epistles in 1680, Sylvae 1685, the satires of Juvenal and Persius 1692, dated 1693, Examen Poeticum 1693, Virgil's Aeneas 1697, Fables Ancient and Modern 1700, and the works of Lucian 1711. In his preface to Ovid's epistles, Dryden proposed a tripartite division of the theory of translation, which includes metaphrase, which is translating a work from word to word and line by line from one language to another, and translating a work from word to word and line by line from one language to another. Paraphrase, in which though the author is taken into consideration, his work is not followed from word to word and is subject to exaggeration, if not alteration, and imitation, in which the translator takes freedom in changing both the word and its meaning and uses the source text only to derive an idea or a hint. Both metaphrase and imitation have been rejected on the grounds that the former provide renderings that are unidiomatic and obscure, while the latter renders too much liberty in the hands of the translator and seem more like original compositions and not translated versions. Therefore, paraphrase was the most celebrated of all the divisions, as it brought balance between the two extremes, which were both impractical and unwelcoming. For the most part of his translating career, Dryden followed the paraphrastic style. However, he sometimes incorporated metaphrase and imitation as per the demand of his literary work. He adopts metaphrase in his translation of Lucretius when he elucidates the Roman poet's vitae fossa, the lacuna that exists when the structure of atoms composing an individual human being is dissolved in death, as pause of life. On the other hand, in Ovid's Art of Love and juvenile satires, Dryden takes a lot from the source text and relates it in context of contemporary London, thereby applying the method of imitation. However, the fact that imitation provides a lot of scope for rewriting cannot be denied. One of the best examples of this in the contemporary times is witnessed in the script of the Bollywood blockbuster Hyder, imitating William Shakespeare's Hamlet. Vishal Bharadwaj changes the setting from Elsinore, Denmark to Kashmir, India, and goes on to depict the age-old problem of territorial conflict between India and Pakistan. A similar form of rewriting can also be found in the script of Gurinder Chandra's Pride and Prejudice, the rewriting of Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice, in which the 19th century England has been replaced by the locals of contemporary Amritsar. Now let us talk about Schleiermacher's notion of the definition of different methods of translation. Friedrich Daniel Ernst Schleiermacher, in his essay Über die verschiedenen Methoden des Übersetzens on the different methods of translation 1813, states that there remains an unabridged gap between the language of the source text and the translator's home language, which makes translation an extremely difficult task and is detrimental in reproducing the meaning faithfully, which should be the primary goal of a translator. Schleiermacher claims that when a translator deals with an alien language, he attempts to paraphrase the author's notion into his own language, in the process of which he gradually begins overlooking the original intention of the original author. The inevitable consequence is rewriting. Schleiermacher also points out the difficulties involved, especially in case of translating poetry, emphasizing upon the fact that when poetry is translated, not only its explication but its musical aspect, including rhyme schemes and meter, are needed to be reproduced as well. And sometimes the word which fits the most into the rhyme scheme or is compatible with the meter might not be the one which reproduces the exact meaning. In order to cope with this difficulty of translating, the translator must have a hermeneutical expertise. Another way is to bring the reader into the world of the original linguistic version of the author, that is to mold the language as much possible into that of the original, in order to communicate as possible an impression of the system of concepts developed in it. In other words, he must valorize the foreign and convert it into target language. As a consequence, if the translator desires to communicate to his readers the same impression that he received from the source text, the reader must also possess the same amount of education and understanding as him or her. Also, there is a requisite for a special language of translation which is able to convey the expression of the foreign. But all these conditions are difficult to be fulfilled by every translator, often resulting into a recreation of the original. Benjamin's view on the task of the translator is quite significant to get into the things of translation as rewriting. An experimental view of translation is adopted by Walter Benjamin in his 1923 essay that Die Aufgabe des Übersetzers, translated into English by Harry Zone as the task of the translator in 1969. The essay originally was an introduction to Benjamin's own German translation of Baudelaire's Tableau's Parisians. However, it gradually emerged as one of the seminal philosophical texts on literary translation. Benjamin discusses that the purpose of translation is not to render meaning to or a better understanding of the original text. Rather, translation exists separately, though in communion with the original as its afterlife, simultaneously providing it with a continued life. Benjamin states that a good translation expresses the reciprocal relationship between languages. It expresses the inherent relationship between two languages, not by referring back to the original, but by creating a harmony between two languages. In the words of Walter Benjamin, a real translation is transparent. It does not cover the original, does not block its light, but allows the pure language as though reinforced by its own medium to shine upon the original all the more fully. This may be advised above all by a literal rendering of the syntax which proves words rather than sentences to be the primary element of the translator. Nida's theory of equivalence also is quite significant to understand our topic. Eugene Nida defines two types of equivalence. While formal equivalence is the rendering of the exact meaning, dynamic equivalence is the passing forward of the equivalent effect of the message. In order to meet the end, the translator should have to prioritize in mind, the first being the priority of the heard language over the written language, especially during translation of such tales or scriptures which the audience has not read but have been hearing in oral form since ages. And such kind of text includes fairy tales and fables, moral stories, and such kind of text. The second priority should be the needs of the audience over the forms of the language. This priority means that the forms understood and accepted by the audience to whom a translation is directed are more significant than the forms which may respect a long literary tradition. Dynamic equivalence, however, has not been well accepted by everybody in the history of translation. Often the translator has been called a traitor and has been accused of altering meanings of the source text in his translated version. It is not always possible to interpret layers of meanings in literary pieces, such as poetry, and simultaneously keeping the syntax and the structure intact. A translation should be successful if it can retain the aesthetic appeal and pleasure of the source language, even if the process involves a bit of alteration or transcreation, and those who believe in untranslatability are mostly the ones who either consider the source text to be a sacred thing or the ones who are too strict regarding the structure, grammar, and syntax of the target language. But the fact which should be taken into consideration is that Cultural disparity between two languages will always exist, and that is why untranslatability happens. For instance, words expression of interjections like mahua, sher o shairi, haire dayan, which exclusively reflect the culture of the Orient, cannot be translated in English, keeping alive the exact cultural value. Besides, the availability of a word in the target language bearing the exact same meaning cannot always be expected. Lawrence Fenuti, in his book The Translator's Invisibility, touches upon the history of translation across the ages. He claims that domesticated practices have led to the invisibility of the translator. According to him, due to legal and cultural constraints, only a faithful rendition of translation, which is actually an illusion of transparency, is accepted. Consequently, any sort of experimental translation fails to receive ready acceptance from publishers and a large scale of Anglophone readers who read to satiate their immediate intelligibility. Thus, the most important criteria of translation tends to be fluency, while all other alterations and foreignness are purposely erased. The translator tends to translate the source text into fluent English in order to make the target text more accessible and readable, thereby creating an illusion of transparency. Now, let us talk about rewriting other than translations. As pointed out by Lefever, rewriting do not consist only of translations. Any sort of reference work, historiography, or even criticisms form a part of rewriting. In other words, rewriting establishes the very identity of a writer, author, and also that of the target culture. All rewriting, whatever their intention, reflect a certain ideology and poetics, and as much manipulate literature to function in a given society in a given way. Thus, rewriting is also a manifestation of the controlling powers of a society. We might say that Lefever makes an attempt to create an impression of the foreign author before the target culture, and also to expose the controlling mechanisms by means of which the foreign image is changed in a literary system. On a positive note, rewriting can introduce new thoughts, beliefs, and components into a society. For instance, the hexameter was introduced into German poetry through the Homer translation of Johann Heinrich Voss. John Joachim Fried's translation of Luigi Pulci reintroduced Otto Rima into English literature, where it was soon picked up by Byron and masterfully used in Don Juan. Refraction. Lefever uses a term called refraction to denote rewriting a text in a manner that will be accepted by the audience targeted. This may result either into a complete metamorphosis of the original or a very little change. The change may either be of the language of the original, the ideology of the original, or of the poetics of the original. Lefever also talks about the restraints of patronage under which the task of translation is undertaken. These restraints might be political, cultural, ideological, or economic in context of the target culture. Now, we can find the similar kind of conception in Indian translation culture also. If we see the history of Indian translation practice, we can find the Indian translation of medieval era, Indian translation of Bhakti period, especially Indian translation of the Ramayana and the Mahabharata, which happened since the medieval period and happened mostly in medieval period in different Indian languages, are actually the retelling. Translation theorists like Indranath Chaudhary, Sujit Mukherjee, Ganesh Devi, Tejashini Niranjana, all these people accepted the mode of translation in India, especially in medieval period, is necessarily retelling. And when A.K. Ramanujan talks about 300 Ramayana, he also hinted the retelling way of translating Indian classics and Indian Puranas and Indian Mahakavyas in modern Indian languages. As far as translation in India concerned, the oral voice and the folklores played a crucial role. When we see the translation of the Ramayana and the Mahabharata, we can find that those translation of Ramayana and Mahabharata not only from the Valmiki's Ramayana or the Vedavyasa's Mahabharata. The translation of the Ramayana Mahabharata in modern Indian languages are from multiple sources. And those sources are Valmiki's Ramayana, Vedavyasa's Mahabharata, and the Ram Katha and Mahabharat Katha, which existed in the oral tradition for long time in Indian culture. The retelling of these folk tales and tales of past glory over the ages inspired the authors and poets to write literary pieces of their own. For instance, the folk alahas of Madhya Pradesh inspired the Hindi poetess Subhadra Kumari Chauhan to write one of her most famous poem, Jhansi Ki Rani. Here in India, the glory of mainstream literature rests not by marginalizing but by accepting oral or folk or loka as complementary. Retelling might be referred to as a means of keeping alive the history of a place through reiteration of its past events in oral form. But in Indian context, oral, tribal or folklore are not merely the residue of the past, but methods of continuing and enriching the present. However, retelling differs from rewriting in the fact that a rewriting cannot take place without the presence of written text. It is the written which is supposed to be rewritten. Now let us conclude our discussion saying this. Therefore, we can infer that translation is a process which involves a socio-cultural exchanges and transportation. Certain purposes are served in the process of translation as it operates in a complex literary and socio-cultural milieu. In order to meet these purposes, translation often takes the form of rewriting, which takes place following all the restraints set by the patronage in the society. As understood, rewriting involves a lot of manipulation, as the translator has to mold it according to the needs of the target audience. However, the contribution made by translations in the literary genres are no less than original compositions. Lawrence Venuti acknowledges the powerful influence of the translators over the society. They preserve and enrich the target literature, enhance trust, understanding, and respect between different cultures, languages, and ideologies, thereby encouraging the globalizing goals of the contemporary times. In the recent years, the concept of transcreation has emerged, which allows ample freedom to the translator during his act. When the term was first used in 1960s and 1970s, its usage was primarily restricted to describe the translation of creative advertisement copies. But if we see the translation as transcreation is already practiced in Indian translation culture since the ancient period. Now, it is also believed by some that the term has its roots in the computer and video games markets in 1980s. But from the world of advertisements and sales markets, the concept of transcreation gradually got transferred into the arenas of literature. One of the modern instances of transcreation would be the internationally acclaimed young adult series of Harry Potter by J.K. Rowling. The words, names and spells that determine the world of fantasy in Rowling will not make sense if translated word to word. This has provided a vast scope for transcreation. The school of wizardry and witchcraft named Hogwarts has become Pox the Lord in French in its French counterpart, which literally means bacon lies. Ravenclaw becomes Sardaigle, which means eagle talon, and Huffpuff become Puffsauffle, meaning out of puff. Transcreation is essentially a method of rewriting which helps the translator to project his proficiency as a writer. This emerging trend of rewriting the original has helped translation studies to carve its own niche in the literary market and evolve as an independent discipline out of the discipline of comparative literature that is originally formed a part of. Thank you.